What if the invisible woman trimming your hedges was actually the person holding your entire future in her hands? I spent half a year playing a mute servant to see who my family truly was when they thought no one was watching. The masks have finally slipped, and what I found behind their polished smiles cost them exactly $50 million. I wasn't who they thought I was. But to understand this, you need to know how it started. 6 months earlier, in a hospital room, listening to a doctor tell me I had maybe 2 good decades left if I was careful, and considerably less if I kept living the way I had been. Before we go deeper into the story, please take a moment to like and subscribe. If you have a second, drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from and what time it is there. It means more than you know. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I built a company from a single warehouse into a business worth just over $300 million. And for 30 years, I was the only version of myself my family had ever met. The version behind a desk, behind a phone, behind a driver and a schedule and a title. CEO, mother, provider, never just a person. That hospital room changed something in me. Not out of self-pity and out of clarity. I had 4 adult children, a second husband, and a small army of relatives who called twice a year, always suspiciously close to my birthday or the holidays. And I realized, lying in that bed, that I had absolutely no idea who any of them actually were when I wasn't in the room writing checks. So I decided to find out. The plan itself wasn't complicated, just extreme. I told my family I was taking an extended trip abroad to recover privately, vague enough that nobody questioned it because, frankly, nobody was that curious about where I actually was. That detail alone told me something, though I didn't want to admit it yet. Meanwhile, an old friend, the only person who knew the truth, a former head of security who owed me more favors than either of us could count, helped me become someone else. A quiet, aging groundskeeper named Rosa. Gray hair pulled back, weathered work clothes, a slight limp I practiced until it looked natural, and most importantly, a story. Mute since a stroke years ago, communicating only through a small notepad and simple gestures. Nobody interrogates a woman who can't talk back. I was hired onto my own estate's garden staff through a legitimate placement agency, under a name and background that led nowhere close to me. My own household manager, a man named Desmond who'd worked for my family for over a decade, interviewed Rosa himself and never once looked twice. That was the first thing that stung. I had shaken his hand at company holiday parties for 10 years. He didn't recognize his employer standing in front of him in old boots and a fake limp, because he'd never really looked at me as a person to begin with. Just a signature on a paycheck. For the first month, I mostly just worked. Real labor, pulling weeds, repairing irrigation lines, trimming the hedges my actual gardener had been neglecting for a while, apparently, since nobody who lived in that house ever walked the property closely enough to notice. That's where I first saw my oldest daughter, Vanessa, 34, groomed for years to eventually take over the company. She walked past me almost every morning on her way to her car, phone against her ear, voice pitched exactly the way I remembered. That particular tone of controlled urgency she used with people she thought mattered. She never once looked at me. Not unfriendly, just invisible. I was scenery. One morning, I overheard her on that same phone call, complaining to someone about how long the old woman is taking to die, in that same casual tone she used for weather small talk. She wasn't being cruel exactly, in her own mind. She clearly thought this was just a private, practical conversation about business continuity. Estate planning? Nothing personal. It still landed like a blade. My son Julian was different, in a way that surprised me at first. He actually spoke to the household staff, asked names, said good morning, seemed considerate. For a few weeks, I let myself believe I'd found at least one person in that house who hadn't been hollowed out by money. Then I watched him fire our longtime cook over a minor scheduling mix-up, in front of the entire household staff with a tone so casually dismissive it made my stomach turn. The same warmth he'd shown me evaporating instantly toward someone he decided didn't matter anymore. I understood then that his kindness toward Rosa wasn't character. It was performance for an audience he considered slightly above the help, but not equal to him. My youngest, Nadia, 26, mostly stayed in her room posting online and asking Desmond for money transfers, which he processed without question, because apparently that had simply become normal. And my second husband, Marcus, 38, married to me for 6 years, spent most evenings on video calls I wasn't meant to overhear, discussing what he called the transition plan with a lawyer whose name I didn't recognize, well before anyone had any real indication my condition was as serious as it was. He was already restructuring his future around my absence calmly, efficiently, months in advance. I want to be honest about something. There were nights during those first 2 months where I nearly ended the whole experiment. Watching your own family calculate your death in financial terms, casually over morning coffee, is not something you recover from easily. I told myself repeatedly that I was being paranoid, that I was catching people on bad days, that this wasn't the full picture. So I kept going. Because if I was wrong, I needed real proof I was wrong, not just hope. Month 3 is when things started to shift. And it started with the small stuff, the way real character usually reveals itself, not in dramatic confrontations, but in tiny, unguarded moments. There was a night a storm knocked out power across the property. Most of the family retreated inside, annoyed, demanding Desmond fix it immediately as though he personally controlled the electrical grid. Only one person came outside in the rain to check whether the staff quarters, where Rosa and 2 other groundskeepers stayed, had heat and light. It was Vanessa's husband, Adrian, who I'd always considered a quiet, forgettable presence at family dinners, someone who'd married into the family and mostly kept to himself. He knocked on our door with flashlights and blankets, apologized for the inconvenience, and asked if we needed anything before checking on the main house at all. He didn't know who I was. He had no reason to perform kindness for an audience. The only person watching was another invisible woman in the dark. I started paying closer attention to Adrian after that. Over the following weeks, I noticed things about him that contradicted the version of him my actual family had always casually dismissed at dinner. Quiet, doesn't say much, not really involved in the business, said with a faint edge of condescension every time. What I actually observed was someone who asked staff members about their families by name, who once spent an entire afternoon helping me, Rosa, repair a fence line without ever once mentioning it to anyone in the main house, as if it weren't worth boasting about. Someone who tipped the delivery drivers out of his own pocket without being asked. Someone who, when Nadia mocked my note-writing communication method at a garden gathering, quietly told her it wasn't funny and to knock it off. The only member of the family who ever defended me at all, without knowing there was anything to defend beyond a mute old woman's dignity. The final piece came in month 5. I'd arranged through Desmond for a routine estate review, paperwork suggesting a significant portion of the family trust was being restructured, with vague language implying most of it would eventually be redirected to a charitable foundation, rather than family inheritance. I let this leak casually through household conversation, the way real information tends to spread in a house full of people who think servants don't listen. Within 72 hours, I watched my family's true priorities crystallize with brutal clarity. Vanessa called an emergency meeting with the family lawyer, not to check on my health, which the paperwork was ostensibly about, but specifically to ask whether the trust restructuring could be legally challenged or delayed until after my death, when she assumed control would default to her regardless of my current wishes. Marcus scheduled a sudden, uncharacteristically affectionate weekend trip for the 2 of us, full of gestures that would have moved me deeply 5 months earlier, and which now read, painfully clearly, as a man trying to secure goodwill before a will got finalized. Julian demanded a private meeting with Desmond to review which staff might be let go if the foundation restructuring goes through, evaluating cost-cutting on household help. Not once asking about my actual well-being, Adrian did something different. He found Desmond privately and asked quietly whether there was anything he personally could do to help make sure the staff, myself and the others, weren't left without income or support if changes were coming. He wasn't thinking about inheritance at all. He was thinking about the people who'd have nothing if the money moved. I ended the experiment 11 days later. I called an actual family meeting, the real me, cleaned up, in a tailored suit again for the first time in 6 months, sitting at the head of my own dining table while Rosa quietly disappeared from the property the same morning, never to be seen again. I watched 4 adult faces cycle through genuine confusion, then shock, then, for at least 2 of them, a very specific kind of horror as they mentally rewound every conversation they'd had in front of a groundskeeper who could apparently hear, understand, and remember every single word. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. I simply told them what I'd heard, in order, without embellishment. Vanessa's phone call, Julian's treatment of the cook, Marcus's transition planning, Nadia's mockery, and then I told them what I'd decided. The actual restructuring, once I finalized it for real, wasn't subtle. $50 million. The portion originally allocated to Vanessa, Marcus, and Nadia combined in various trusts and direct inheritances was redirected. A significant education and housing charitable foundation absorbed the bulk of it, one that specifically supports household staff, caregivers, and service workers transitioning into stable long-term housing, an idea I built directly from watching how casually my family had discussed discarding the people who'd quietly kept their entire lives running. Julian retained a reduced but still substantial inheritance, with a formal condition requiring active, hands-on involvement in a family charitable board for at least 5 years before full access, a chance to actually prove, not just perform, character Adrian and Vanessa together. Were given controlling operational oversight of the newly formed foundation, along with a meaningful equity stake in the company itself. Not because he'd married into money, but because he was the only person in that house who treated an invisible woman like she was still a person worth checking on in a storm. Vanessa still works in the company, technically, but no longer holds the executive succession path she assumed was guaranteed. Marcus and I are, as of this recording, in the final stages of a quiet, amicable divorce. Nadia, for the first time in her life, is required to work an actual entry-level position in the company before receiving another cent, earning it the way I once had to. I don't regret 6 months as a silent old woman nobody bothered to see clearly. I regret more that it took nearly dying and disappearing entirely to finally understand exactly who was standing beside me, and who was only ever standing beside my money.